Hi, I'm Kate, and I have a confession. My talk is actually not about React, so imagine for a moment that you're at JS Girls Conference, or probably just conference because it's actually not about JavaScript either. This is my Twitter handle, Southern Belle in London, so feel free to @me. I'd love to hear your thoughts about the talk, or you can just send me like cute photos of your pets. I love that. Last year I attended a coding boot camp called Founders and Coders here in London. We got a couple of fact people in the audience, from July to October. Before that, I was an office manager, a customer service rep, photographer, barista, like everything except a developer, pretty much. And now I work as a junior engineer at the Financial Times, an internal product where we build tools that help our colleagues across the FT work smarter and better serve our customers. When I'm not coding, I enjoy a bit of photography, writing, cycling, and all things coffee. And I have two beautiful guinea pigs named Mopsa and Phoebe. Although I generally only show photos of Mopsa because she's the photogenic one in the family. I pretty much only give talks to show off my guinea pigs. But most of my talk today is going to focus on my time at Founders and Coders, or FAC as we call it. So what is Founders and Coders? It is a UK-based nonprofit that develops and runs tuition-free, peer-led training programs in web development, guided by our core values of cooperation, inclusion, and social impact. So in straightforward terms, that means that the course is free. We don't have paid teachers. Each cohort is taught by the previous cohort, who become our mentors, overseen by a course facilitator. And our mentors are there to introduce concepts to us and guide us when we get stuck. But the curriculum is all available on GitHub, and we're largely responsible for teaching ourselves through pair programming and group research. So the curriculum has been built up and evolved over the years by each cohort, and at the end of our time at FAC, we take a look back at what we thought was taught well, what wasn't, and what we think should be changed. Decisions about course content, how the program is run, etc., are made cooperatively and by consensus. And I mentioned these things in passing now, not only because they're central to the FAC experience, but because they have a bearing on what I talk about later on. So this is my cohort, FAC 14. I think some of them might be watching the live stream. Hello. Plus some of our mentors, our course facilitator, Lucy, and Dan Sofer in the yellow there that runs the program. And if we all look a bit bewildered, hot, and bothered, that's because it was week 2 and we'd just been introduced to test-driven development. And we were kind of starting to realize what we got ourselves into. And also last summer in London, it was just silly hot all the time. It was like 35 degrees in that room, 95 Fahrenheit for my fellow Americans. Here's FAC 15, pictured with course facilitator Michael in the blue flannel, who is from my cohort, and some other FAC 14 people as mentors up front. And the current cohort, FAC 16, like this photo, y'all, with Charlie as the course facilitator front and center. I think he wrangled this double denim thing. I'm a bit jealous, but I try to tell myself that my cohort could not have done this photo because we were like literally melting. So, what does it mean to become a full stack developer at FAC? It's basically a full-time job where your job is learning, Monday to Friday, 10 to 6. So starting in week 1, we have our toolkit week, which brings together our CSS, HTML, and JavaScript knowledge from the course prep work. And it starts us working together on version control using Git. And you've never seen so many merge conflicts in one room, trust me. So over the next few weeks, we learn test-driven development, callbacks, HTTP request response basics, building a server with Node, shell scripting, building, connecting to, and working with databases, SQL, authentication, promises, Node Express, and templating with handlebars. Each week is rounded off with a project built in 1.5 days using the concepts learned that week and building on previous week's concepts. And it's all the things you need to be able to come out of the other end to build web apps for clients in the second half of the course. Learned in 8 weeks. If it sounds like a lot, that's because it is. It's very overwhelming. A pretty significant amount of time was dedicated to feeling like this. At the end of most weeks, we felt kind of like we were holding on to these concepts by the skin of our teeth. Callbacks week, and yes, React week especially. Yet somehow when we came back from reading week and started on our client projects in week 10, we were doing what they said we'd do, building apps using everything we'd learned. And they looked good, and they worked. And somehow we realized we'd learned to code, which kind of made us feel even more like this, to be honest. So I find it pretty cool that you can bring a disparate group of people together, throw them in a pressure kettle, essentially give them a new skill in 8 weeks and a new career path in 16. So to me, figuring out how this is possible is about looking at the environment in which this can happen and what factors have the biggest influence. And for me, the single biggest factor at Founders and Coders is a culture based on psychological safety. Psychological safety is a term coined by Amy Edmondson, a behavioral scientist at Harvard, and is defined as a shared belief held by members of a team that the team is safe for interpersonal risk-taking. So this means being able to be yourself, speak up, make and admit to mistakes, share knowledge and ideas, and more, all without fear of negative consequences of self-image, status, or career. It's gotten a lot of attention in recent years as a contributing factor to organizations that are high-performing, innovative, creative, and fast-moving. The study that seems to crop up the most is around Google's Project Aristotle, which found that the best-performing teams shared some common traits. They could depend on each other, they had clearly defined goals and roles, meaningful work to work on, and they felt that their work had an impact within the team. But that wasn't enough. They also had to feel okay to challenge each other, ask questions, even the silly ones, and sometimes fail and admit to mistakes, meaning that they needed to feel psychologically safe with their team. Psychological safety was the underpinning that held everything else together. So this all sounds great for teams at a job, and it is, but what does it necessarily have to do at an environment like FAC, where learning is the main goal? The thing about learning, especially a skill such as coding, where you have to practice and build with the concepts you're learning, is that you're going to make a lot of mistakes and probably have more than a few complete failures and roadblocks along the way. And you're going to be overflowing with questions like almost all the time. And when you have 16 weeks to acquire the skills you need to get a job in coding, you don't have time to be immobilized by the fear of whether you can speak up and ask a question or not, or be afraid to present something you think isn't perfect. It requires unlearning some preconceptions we generally have about whether it's all right to fail publicly, whether it's okay to not quite understand something the first time, whether it's okay to be the person in the group who sets the pace because you need more time to grasp a concept. You have to very deliberately set out to build an environment and culture where people understand that these things are okay and expected. So what are some things that FAC has done to create this environment? First, I think you need to set expectations and get everyone involved. One of Edmondson's papers says, one practical takeaway from the literature on psychological safety is that this positive interpersonal climate, which is conducive to learning and performance under uncertainty, doesn't emerge naturally, meaning you have to build it yourself. Because psychological safety focuses on a group member's beliefs about a group's norms, this means you have to first set those norms. We sign a student agreement and a code of conduct coming into FAC, which then sets the groundwork for how we deal with each other. The short form is our community is dedicated to providing a harassment-free experience for everyone. It's important for people to know that they can participate in a team or community and won't be excluded or harassed, and that's an example of a step towards psychological safety within a group. So a code of conduct and house rules are basics to have, but you can go even further. In my first week as a mentor for FAC 15, the course facilitator, Michael, asked them to go that step further and come up with their own code of conduct beyond the FAC one. Of course, you'd expect a harassment-free experience at the very least, but what else would you expect from your cohort and how you deal with each other? And this is what they came up with. There's a lot of gems in here. I especially love giving people time and space to answer and checking for mutual understanding, for example, when pair programming. What I found interesting was that most of this stuff were things that my cohort had come to verbalize at some point and agree to over the course of our 16 weeks together. Unfortunately, sometimes after things had gotten super stressy. But some of this stuff is part of the ethos of FAC in general. But by sitting down on day one and explicitly codifying how they deal with each other and what they expected from each other, FAC 15 was already pretty far ahead of where we were on a cohort, as a cohort on day one. It showed me that it's important to not just hand down things like a code of conduct or group norms, but actively have members of a team, group, or community involved in creating it so that people feel like their voices are being represented and they know that fellow members are aware of and also share these same values. But that's not it. You can't just lay down the rules once and expect things to be fine forever. It requires maintenance. Think of it as technical debt, except cultural debt. So group dynamics change, you learn new things and go through new experiences together. Communication is key. You have to evaluate new knowledge and experiences and decide if things need to change based on input. So for example, at FAC, we had retrospectives called SGCs, Stop, Go, Continue, at the end of each week. We were encouraged to reflect on the week, how we felt about the material, how it was taught, what we did well, what we wanted to keep doing, and what we thought shouldn't continue. So topics ranged from things like, hey, let's stop forgetting to water the plants. They looked very sad and they didn't like the heat as well. To let's give more time to this workshop on callbacks because it turned my brain inside out. To more contentious stuff like certain conflicts that had arisen over the week and things people were uncomfortable with or unhappy about. By constantly talking about everything that was happening, we made sure everyone was on the same page and that things were brought out into the open that needed to be dealt with, and we all had our say in the continued building of our cohort's culture. And speaking of bringing up difficult things, that's probably the most misunderstood aspect of psychological safety. Having psychological safety in a group doesn't mean being super nice and shiny and happy all the time. In fact, that can be counterproductive. If you feel you have to put on a good face and everyone always has to smile, then things can go unfixed that ought to be addressed. Conflict and criticism are naturally a part of building a psychologically safe environment, but just as much as psychological safety doesn't equal happiness and rainbows, conflict and criticism does not equal being mean-spirited. It takes work and curation of discussion from everyone involved to ensure that things don't end up that way. One of my favorite lines about criticism comes from Feminist Frequency, a podcast that critiques pop culture media. Their motto is to be critical of the media you love. And I think that captures it for me, that if you care about something, a community you're part of, for example, and you want to improve it, you should be able to offer constructive criticism that helps them improve. An ethos of leave things better than you found it. At our Stop Go Continues, often critique was aimed at how some of the material was taught, followed by productive discussions of how it could be improved for future cohorts. And if you're going to make it okay for people to offer criticism for improvements, you need to encourage candor and people being honest about their experiences and feelings. Going back to the bit about reevaluating expectations as things change, one of the things that happened in my cohort was that we were given a guideline in week 1 to try and make sure that on each project we built, each team member had roughly the same number of Git commits. Seems straightforward enough. Fast forward to about week 6 or 7 and something had happened. There were a lot of people upset that some weeks, some team members would have far more commits than others. Some people were worried because they'd heard that employers looked at GitHub commits as evidence of how much you contributed to a project and made judgments based on this. Naturally, this made them really nervous about being seen to be falling behind. Others simply saw commit numbers as a guideline for measuring that everyone was getting about the same amount of coding practice while pairing and were more relaxed about it. Some harsh words were said, and generally there were some misunderstandings and bad feelings all around. It wasn't really like this. I can confirm that no chairs were thrown, but it probably felt like that at the time because everything had been super chill otherwise. So finally this was brought up in Stop, Go, Continue. It was probably the hardest discussion we had as there were a lot of strong feelings on both sides, and there was a heck of a lot of candor. But after weeks of build-up, finally it was out in the open, and we were able to discuss it and moderate it, and rather than bottling it up and making assumptions about people's motivations or thought processes, which was unfortunately an example of something that we didn't do so well for a while. I'm not entirely sure if we ever actually all agreed on why commits were important, but going forward, at least both sides had an understanding of each other and how they felt, and there was less focus on the number of commits and more of a refocus on making sure everyone was doing the same amount of work when pairing because that practice was how we learned. And that was what we needed because it was part of what we should have been focused on all along, the success of the group over the success of the individual. It might seem counterintuitive that learning at a breakneck pace would mean at FAC moving at the speed of people who need the most help. But FAC does a lot to break down assumptions that you're holding anyone back in this case. We're told over and over from day 1 that some weeks will be the teachers, we'll understand the concepts, and when we do, we should happily help those around us and bring them up to our level. But some weeks will be the students. We'll have more trouble grasping things, and we'll be the ones asking more questions, needing more guidance, and when we are, we shouldn't feel embarrassed to ask as much as we need. The great thing is, when you tell people that over and over, they feel less like this, and When they don't know something, they begin to speak up about questions they have, and others answer without judgment. It does begin to breed an atmosphere of confidence that you can be open about your struggles and what you need to keep up with everyone else. Often we'd have someone stand up from a group and say to the whole room, hey, I'm having trouble with this problem. Anyone else? And usually, yeah, someone was, and they'd help you solve it together. At the end of each week, we'd give presentations talking about what we learned, what we got stuck on, and other tidbits of knowledge that we found cool that other groups might not have learned. The end result is that we'd all make it to the end of the week knowing the same stuff, and often a lot more than if we tried to focus on learning these things individually. Instead of this, a mad rush to make the coolest project and get kudos for showing off all of your knowledge. It was more like this, where we shared our highest highs and helpful tidbits of info, and also our big mistakes so that others could avoid them and learn from them. And speaking of learning from mistakes and failing, which I've mentioned a lot, I think you have to normalize it. And that takes work and repetition, and it's really hard. Unfortunately, failure is largely seen as something shameful to be dissected afterwards and find everything that led to it so you can avoid any failure ever again. It's not a great attitude because you can often learn a lot from making mistakes and failing. I'm not sure how y'all learned to code, but I bet it involved a lot of trial and error and probably in private if you were lucky. We don't really have that luxury at FAC. We're thrown together for 16 weeks and we're learning in front of each other constantly, so it's hard to hide anything. We have to get comfortable with it, and believe me when I say that our course facilitator had to remind us week after week that it was okay to not have a perfectly polished project, and we had to work to remind each other within our groups as we worked on these projects. We became more comfortable with the idea that we wouldn't be mocked for failures, and that actually people would help us find our way out of these issues, and we'd all learn a lot more by talking openly about them. We confront things earlier on in our projects as a result, and sometimes avoid potential mistakes because we felt okay to bring up things we were struggling with. But, hey, sometimes mistakes and failures still happen, and that was okay too. My group's final mini project, where we learned Express and handlebars, had exactly one working page, a 404 page. I'm just going to let you marinate with this for a moment while I explain. Our presentation that week was basically just a parade of all the mistakes we'd made, making the scope of our 1.5-day project way, way too big, not researching the limits of the API we wanted to use, trying out lots of new NPM packages that we hadn't ever dealt with before, because why not? And following the sunk cost fallacy because we spent hours trying to make some of these things work and wouldn't abandon it simply because we'd already spent hours on it, and surely we were so close to getting things to work. And you know what? I bet our cohort learned a lot from our mistakes, certainly things that were relevant to the second half of the course, where project scope and time management would be critical. It could have been a really uncomfortable presentation elsewhere showing our 404-page app, but we knew we were in a safe, constructive environment. So we had a lot of fun really deconstructing how our project went wrong at every single stage. We even went to the post office at lunch and bought confetti poppers for people to let off at the end of the presentation, since it was the last week before reading week and we were all finally going to get a break. And there were plenty of gifts and laughs, especially the skiff. And this project also yielded one of the best, spiciest comments I think I will ever receive on GitHub. I loved it. Yeah. So why does our culture at FAC and psychological safety in general matter so much? Because when we deliberately build these kind of environments, we're creating places where we and others can be our best selves, because we can ask all of the questions, try all of the things, troubleshoot our mistakes, and learn from our collective failures, all without the guilt and fear I think a lot of us have picked up at some point or another. Without all that baggage, imagine how much faster we could learn from each other and progress. When we set out to build the projects we work on in our jobs and on the side, we often spend time prepping, planning the architecture, choosing the stack. And as we build, we refactor and improve it and constantly strive to make it better. We should be just as deliberate and caring about the teams and communities we build and take part in, to create the kind of environments where we can feel safe and flourish and be our best selves. So I hope your takeaways today are that you have to be deliberate about the culture you build and not just leave it to chance. You have to actively maintain it and change it as your team, community, or group grows, and you have to keep everyone involved. And it won't always be sunshine and rainbows, but in the end, it's going to be worth it. So I hope you'll try and bring some of this to your teams at work, the communities you're part of, like the React community, the meetups that you attend or run, and more. We're able to achieve so much at Founders and Coders because we flourished in our environment, and I'd love to see more spaces like that where others can do that too. Thanks.